Let me start. Friends, my name is Biraj Patnaik, and I work with the National Foundation for India in Delhi, which I've been heading for the last 1 year. And before this, I used to head the South Asia operations of Amnesty International as the South Asia director. And I'm very glad to be part of this panel with Michael and Max. Uh, Over to Michael.
Hi, I'm sorry, I completely misunderstood my introductory cues. My name is Michael Barnett. I'm a professor of political science and international relations at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I've spent a good part of my life now observing and studying the history of the humanitarian sector.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Max Lawson. I work for Oxfam, and I am also chair of the People's Vaccine Campaign at the moment. So I'm head of inequality policy at Oxfam and chair of the People's Vaccine Campaign. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today.
So, friends, we've joined this panel today on responding to protests on humanitarian action and social movements, and this is just a freewheeling discussion between three of us. I'd like to apologize that this is a panel because the organizers informed us at the very last minute that the women participants had pulled out of the panel, so it's left to us. But apologies again for this because it's quite unacceptable, and each one of us would agree to that. I now, as part of this annual event today, the question that we are looking at is whether humanitarian organizations have the space and should intervene in larger social movements, which are currently on in various parts of the world. We've seen a lot of tumult within the humanitarian sector over the last few years, particularly in the last 3 years, with the interface that we have seen, the restructuring, the rethinking, the reevaluating, the reimagining the space of the humanitarian movement. Given the number of instances where we've had to contend with larger social movements, the last being the Black Lives Matter, which really shook all organizations. So I just kick it off by requesting Max and Michael with a few introductory remarks to begin with, just to lay the context, and then we can go on with our individual discussions on the context that we are coming from, the space, the shrinking space that we are confronted with in countries like India and so on. So, any one of you, Michael or Max?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I teach on humanitarianism. I teach a lot about the history. And a lot of the events that we're seeing, and not just the events, but also the tensions and the dilemmas and the controversies within the field are not happening for the first time. In fact, these issues have been recurring in one form or another ever since humanitarianism came on the world stage. One of the perennial issues, though, has always been about how do you define these boundaries of humanitarianism? What's in its in basket? What does it do? But then also, what does it not do? And there are so many documents, founding documents, and those over the years that have said what humanitarianism does is it's modest in that it saves lives. It doesn't do anything beyond that. And one of the things it does not do is it does not do justice. That justice is something that we'll leave to God, we'll leave to human rights activists, we'll leave to development specialists, that we will not engage in justice movements for a variety of reasons. And so that's been oftentimes kind of a no-go. But it's very difficult to keep these walls without being breached. It's very difficult to say we're just doing one thing, saving lives, for instance, or helping those in emergency situations, without also taking on some form of justice. And the debate has always been, it's not just global, but it's also understood locally in terms of how you balance these tensions between being very practical and very short-termism versus being, if you will, more aspirational and long-termism. And again, this is something that has bedeviled the humanitarian sector for decades, and it's really come crashing down over the last several years, not just because of Black Lives Matter, but also, as you know, Max can talk about more, COVID and inequalities and how that's related to justices and injustice, but also localization and increasingly climate change. And the question is, given this kind of broad set of developments and pressures, where does humanitarianism sit, and can it, if you will, shield itself from being dragged into these bigger justice questions?
Really, really fascinating discussions. I think can I start by talking about the birth of Oxfam, which I always think is very instructive in these discussions. So it was the middle of the Second World War, and people think that Winston Churchill was universally popular in the UK, but there are many people who felt that the way he was prosecuting the war was abusing many, many human rights. And one of these included a blockade of Greece. And this blockade of Greece was because Greece was under Nazi control, but they were starving the Greek people, and no food could get into Greece. And the Oxfam was set up together with many other. It's the Oxford Famine Relief Campaign, but there were others in other cities. There was a Man Fam for Manchester, there was a Lund Fam, but Oxfam was the one that continued into the future. And the campaign was a humanitarian campaign. It was not about Oxfam delivering any food to Greece. It was about Winston Churchill letting food supplies get through. And I think that's the key point, that from our birth, it was about humanitarian campaigning and access of food and the right to life of Greeks, even if they are under the heel of the Nazi regime. And then similarly later on, after that campaign failed, by the way. That's also quite a sad birthing story. We've had many successful campaigns since, but Winston Churchill was a very stubborn man. And Greece, to this day, I think the per capita death from famine during that moment in Greece was still one of the highest in history. But then after the war, there was a situation where the Germans themselves were starving. And there was a famous Jewish journalist for the Observer. He wrote a piece about the starvation of the Germans, and there was a huge outpouring of public sympathy in the UK, which I think is amazing to this day. That people, even after a long war, even after being told these people are the enemy for so long, the depth and the well of public sympathy was enormous, and people wanted to send their own rationed food to Germany. And the government said, you can't, you're not allowed to. So we had that campaign, which was a Labour government, Churchill was gone by then, was successful. And again, we enabled the humanitarian instincts, if you like, of humanity to be kind of manifested, and people could send food to starving Germans. And I love those two stories, because I think it just shows you just how wrapped up, just as you say, Michael, this campaigning, these issues of justice and the kind of humanitarian imperative are entirely inseparable. But then the operational reality, as years go on and Oxfam got bigger and bigger and bigger at delivering massive humanitarian programs. I visited many of them myself, responsibility for the water and clean water and sanitation to tens of thousands of people. And then we've got policy and campaigners who say, we want to say something rude about the South Sudanese government. We think the way they're exploiting the oil resources and keeping all the money is a disaster. And not surprisingly, a whole humanitarian department that's got tens of thousands of people reliant on our water supplies says, actually, I don't want Oxfam to say anything about the South Sudanese government, because we'll get thrown out of the country and all of these people will suffer. And those very real tensions, I think I've lived within Oxfam for the last 20 years. And I agree with you, Michael. They are very they're old ones. But I suppose as a campaigner, I point to the fact that the campaigning for justice comes first and the operationality comes second. And ultimately, that's what the localization agenda is about. That's what the forcing governments to take responsibility for crises within their own borders. And that's the sustainable future of the humanitarian imperative. So I've always defended the campaigning as absolutely vital. That doesn't mean it always trumps the delivery, and those are the creative discussions we have all the time. But I do think it's impossible to kind of wall yourself off from these justice issues. I would completely agree with Michael on that one. I think that history of Oxfam really demonstrates that, and I think I like to see it as a creative and constructive dilemma that we keep having to rediscuss in every situation.
Yeah, if I could just jump in real quick. I think, Max, what you point out is that, again, there's sort of two levels in many ways of justice. So your example, for instance, of post-World War II, I mean, you're absolutely right that when the Allied forces, and it wasn't just the Allied forces, there were, in many ways, the Allied populations looking at the starving Germans. And, many people argued, look at the Germans, there's a limited amount of relief we can distribute, that the Germans are not deserving. And this is sort of one of those tropes of humanitarianism. They're deserving and undeserving victims. And the Germans are undeserving victims. And so when it comes to sort of the justice of distribution and triage, who gets your attention first? It should not be the Germans. They should go last in line because they're undeserving. But as you point out, then there's the contrary principle of humanitarianism, which says, no, triage goes based on need alone, that we're not going to be making decisions on sort of who we like and who we don't like. That's not going to factor in. And then there's that. So that's that short term where justice does creep in. And then there's a long term, which is more about, if our goal is, for instance, and we see this right now in Afghanistan, where it is about, we know that the Afghan economy is collapsing, and yet there are different organizations that say we should make aid conditional, that we're not going to provide aid unless the Taliban, for instance, open the schools to girls. And then there are others, of course, who say that is unconscionable, that rather we should make aid unconditional, and we should never, use food as a weapon. And so these debates are perennial. And whether in the case of the contemporary Afghanistan, whether our goals are short term, which is to feed a starving population, give them aid, let them try to recover, or should we be thinking about a longer term agenda like rights and participation and education? And these are the kinds of things that are constantly being debated, even if we're not aware of them.
Yeah. And Michael, if I can jump in now to say that there are definitely situations where humanitarian organizations are not left with a choice. And I think that situation, it's exemplified with what's happening in India with the shrinking civic space. Now, as you know, India is confronted with the issue of elected autocracy of some kind, much in the same way that you had Trump in the US, you have Orban in Hungary, you have Philippines, Duterte, you have Turkey, and so on. And in this situation, when the civic space shrinks, both because of the capture of the popular narrative by the state, which gives out a certain narrative about the state, and second, by bringing in restrictive laws. At that point in time, I think that there is no choice for humanitarian organizations but to stand shoulder to shoulder with social movements, because it then becomes a question of an existential crisis. Now, for instance, in India, and this is the steer given to me by the organizers to speak a bit on the changes in laws recently, which have sort of impacted civil society greatly. One of them, for instance, is the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which governs every organization in India, which brings in foreign money, which covers, therefore, every humanitarian organization. Now, beginning 2010 onwards, the then government, which was the UPA government led by the Congress Party, changed the law to make it mandatory for organizations to re-register for their licenses. And the moment the right wing government in India came to power, this translated to 16,000 organizations having their registrations cancelled, many because of reasons that were justified, but a large number which was a part of a crackdown. So, and subsequently, around 23,000 organizations, the ability to get foreign funding has been suspended or cancelled by the government, crippling these organizations. So, that was the first wave of attacks against civil society, which impacted everybody. Last year, in the middle of a pandemic, when there was COVID raging all over the country, when the state response was very weak, when civil society stepped up to fill the gap of the state response, the government again changed the rules. For instance, they no longer allowed any foreign money that's coming in to be re-granted. So Oxfam, in India, with limited ability to reach out, or MSF with a limited ability to reach out in different parts, would therefore then transfer this money to smaller organizations. Now that ability was taken away. Every single one of the 20,000 organizations were asked to operate only one bank account in one particular branch of the State Bank of India in Delhi. So it didn't matter whichever part of, and India is a large country, whichever part of the country you came from, it was just this. You had the government capping admin expenses. It's the only industry in the country where the government determines what you can spend and how you spend it. So they are micromanaging the expenses. And frighteningly, it gave the state the right to appropriate every asset that you have historically created out of. So suppose you built a school with foreign money, and tomorrow your license is cancelled. The school building, premises, everything around the school, every asset that you have physically, or any monies you have saved up to build a corpus or an endowment, would go back to the government. Now, this completely crippled civil society, and most organizations had to therefore get out of re-granting and try to set up their operations. So it lends us to the broader question that can humanitarian organizations be therefore separate from the larger crackdown on civic space? And do they have a choice but not to protest and stand shoulder to shoulder with other civil society organizations? And how do you counter this popular narrative that humanitarian actions are affected by political interests in the West? That all actions, including that of humanitarian agencies, is Western interference, which is the trope that is most common, whether it's the attack on the Open Society Foundations by Hungary, led by Orban, whether it's a crackdown on amnesty, both in India and Erdogan in Turkey, where the chair and director of Amnesty were put in prison and had to be in jail for 9 months, to other instances across the world where this trope of outside interference or Western interference today governs the state's creation of this popular narrative of humanitarian action. So maybe that's something we should also cover.
Well, can I ask you as a follow-up then?
Sure.
Because what I hear are, is that dilemma from you, which is, on the one hand, humanitarian organizations need to stand shoulder to shoulder with civil society organizations and social justice organizations because they're facing a common threat. On the other hand, I do hear that to the extent to which humanitarian organizations do stand shoulder to shoulder, they will be identified, though, with the West. And with association with Western values and Western imperialism, when in fact what a lot of humanitarian organizations want to do is say, no, these are not Western values. What we're standing for are human values, and therefore they are not political. So I hear from you this kind of tension, which is we need to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder, but not so much that that our own identity becomes co-opted and politicized.
Yeah, no, I think that is the dynamic tension that exists. And on the ground, one way in which it is resolved often, and I speak to my experience not just in India, but in other parts of South Asia where I worked, and indeed other parts of Asia as well, that the main stage of the protest is always held by local civil society, more often than not in most contexts. Whereas a lot of the lobbying, the background work, the discussions in Western capitals, the awareness raising abroad, is then taken on by by the organizations whose presence on stage, for instance, would be perceived as foreign interference. So that is a practical way of resolving it, but this tension remains because whatever you do, the popular narrative still gets linked, and it sort of it's a narrative that's completely controlled by the elected authoritarians now in multiple contexts. And I think how we resolve this is quite critical to the way we reimagine civil society spaces in the global south.
It's such a dilemma, isn't it? And I think it's I suppose if I think of the particulars, it's quite hard to reach general conclusions in some of this. Personally, I prefer general conclusions because I'm quite simple-minded. But I think if there's one, and there are lots of tropes, and if you like, kind of very kind of platitudes about being partner-led and all of those things. But I do think this is one of those spaces where, I think to Michael's point, the added value of Oxfam or Western organisations weighing in such a situation needs to be weighed up in every situation, doesn't it? And in some of them, it will entirely backfire and make things even worse. In others, it may improve the situation. And I can imagine there are examples of both, So I don't, I'm not sure there is an obvious answer to this question of the relationship between kind of civil society space and the kind of vocal speaking out of particular, if you like, Western or perceived Western organisations. Michael, I think you're talking, but you're on mute.
Thank you. I was saying, Biraj, can I put you on the spot for a moment then? Which is, what would you want Max as a representative of Oxfam to do in this situation? So,
to be honest, Michael, I think Oxfam in India has already done what needed to be done at that stage.
Thank goodness.
Which is
you kind of had to say that, Biraj. But anyway, thank you that you said that.
Which is really no, because I've also worked closely with Amitabh, who heads Oxfam in India on some of these issues, way before he joined Oxfam, and we have both been struggling with this dilemma at various parts of various stages of our life. And I think the way it was played was very, very clear. It was played on the front foot. It was played clearly. There was a line of response which was common to all of civil society in India. And the head of Oxfam India, Amitabh Behar, responded publicly, not just here in India, but to the global audience on many of these issues, and used or ensured that the communication machinery that Oxfam has globally, the comms machine, was put to use to amplify the voice of local civil society organizations, many of whom are much smaller and would not want to speak up for fear of reprisal or retribution. So in that sense, this was one of the rare examples, I would say, where the coordination between agencies happened, and it happened because it was an existential threat. It does not happen in other contexts. For instance, if you take the broader social movements in India, be it the movement on citizenship, which was launched because of the attempt by the government to restrict refugees who are coming in who are Muslim, any citizenship right in India. And what many Muslims across the country perceived was an attempt to reduce their citizenship. It was a nationwide movement and led by women primarily. Or if you take the recent farmers' protests, I think those are spaces where you still find a lot of doubt and dilemma on the way forward. And while Oxfam may be an exception, a number of other humanitarian organizations in India have chosen to remain silent at a time when silence is complicit, and not weigh in, despite the fact that they are working on the issues that the protesters stand for, in many cases providing relief to communities who are directly impacted. So I think that's where the question arises, on really the structural, what are the structural issues that one thinks prevents them from doing that. And Michael, I think you raised this interesting point about, you just alluded to it on the debate on localization,
Mm.
which has been going on for very many years now. And I think one of the structural reasons that impede some of the quicker responses that one expects from humanitarian organizations on the ground in responding to social movements is primarily because localization, I think, has been seen only in terms of identity. And this was heightened really by the BLM movement. So the issue of identity and representation, which indisputably is very, very critical, was seen as the primary driver of localization, or the primary indicator of how localized you were. But I think the larger humanitarian movement and the Western-based organizations in the global North, did not address the question of where the power lay, irrespective of who was being represented
Yep.
on the ground by what. And I think, that tension remains unresolved because, as I said, when I joined Amnesty, Amnesty was really, it had done away with a large proportion of its London staff. It had shifted out of the global North into 14 regional offices, and I was recruited to head one of those offices, which is the South Asia office in Colombo. And my own experience was that yes, it did manage greatly to transfer resources and people to the global South, and I have a lot of people from the global South who were there. But it was incomplete in a sense because a lot of the business processes which were at the heart of the organization and the financing of the organization remained in the global North. And because this was not resolved, you could not truly have the kind of representative presence that could address this question of social, of
Mm.
standing shoulder to shoulder with social justice movements in a way that it needed to. So I mean, that would be what I would say to that issue. But I don't know where you and Max would come on that.
I think it's a fascinating one because if we take your mercifully positive story about Oxfam, Biraj, then maybe what something else that's happened to Oxfam in India in the last 10 years is we've created Oxfam India, and all the big kind of Oxfams like Oxfam Great Britain um, kind of really reduced their footprint in India and left Oxfam India very much without enough money and really trying to struggle, find its own way. So it was not a smooth process at all. But they also left them with quite considerable control over decisions that were made and the direction they took and the politics of it, almost by accident. And I wonder whether if it had been 5, 10 years ago, we would have had the same decision. I certainly was in. I mean, maybe I'm saying too much, and I should be less honest. But I've been in lots and lots of meetings in Oxfam over the years where everyone talks about. Everyone's put. Say, I remember when the government of Nicaragua they wanted to throw Oxfam out, and there was a big discussion of senior management. Okay, maybe we should speak out because the social movements were being crushed by Ortega. It was a really terrible situation. But you always kind of knew where that meeting would end up. You knew we would end up choosing to keep quiet. And it was disappointing to see it the first time, but then it became a bit repetitive. And I think that was more the example of where we had a country office, but that was basically controlled and run from Oxford. And when you've got big programs and big funding arrangements and just a lot going on, the natural conservatism. I wouldn't say it's deliberate, but it's just people's natural conservatism. Is like, we've got all this at stake. I don't think this is the time to speak. That obviously we should speak at some point in the future, but right now we've weighed it all up and we've made that decision. And I saw that happen time and time again. So I think that is a structural thing. I don't think you can ever get around it. I don't think any of those people are being malevolent. I think that's just the way that they operationalize. And when your delivery budget, if you like, and the infrastructure around it far outweighs your campaigns and advocacy budget. So you're in a position like at that point with Oxfam Great Britain, where 85% of your funding is going into delivery of programming on the ground. So that's 85% of the management. It's like 85% of the people around the table. Their job is to deliver good programming on the ground. Their job is not to speak out on social injustice. It's not to speak out against violation of rights. They may well have joined Oxfam because that excites them, but ultimately it's not their responsibility. So you end up with a mismatch, which I think is very hard to avoid in a big delivery organisation. Even though people's hearts would never say that's where it ends up. That would be my candid response on that one.
But it sounds like, from what you're describing, Max, that with, let's just call it decentralization in that case, right? Where there is where you're creating these country offices that have some independence, but that means, as we've seen so many times, they become more implicated in national campaigns and national politics. And so the consequence then is that in some ways they get nationalized. And as they get nationalized, they become much more sensitive in different ways to the politics, which then means that they're very unable to speak out in the ways that you want, which may put them in opposition to, or at least in a debate with the international, Oxfam. And I think about, as we talk about it, I think a little bit of the early years of the ICRC, when you had the National Red Cross Societies. And, what we now know from the history is the extent to which, once you had the National Red Cross Societies, and I'm speaking of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, they became nationalized and militarized. So you go back and look at these American Red Cross posters, and it's "Give blood for the boys." It's not "Give blood for humanity." It's "Give blood for our soldiers." And, this becomes part of a nationalist campaign, which of course meant that this was not a cosmopolitan organization anymore, at least in terms of the local chapters. This was a national organization, which put them really at odds. And so it does, as we think about devolving power, one of those questions then is, what comes with it? Does it mean that you're more vulnerable to national and local politics than you otherwise would like to be?
I think that's fascinating. It's almost the opposite example, actually, Michael. So we have that a lot as well. So we wanted to call Hong Kong a tax haven, and Oxfam China was refusing to sign it off. And many of us were thinking, I wish we didn't have an Oxfam China, because then we could just call Hong Kong a tax haven, because it is, by any objective measure, as much of a tax haven as Bahamas or the Netherlands. We had the same problem with Oxfam Island, I might add. This isn't about the global south. It is about when you have people who are really embedded in national politics. But the example I was giving was the opposite, in fact, where Oxfam India has been much more vocal and ambitious about challenging national politics than I think it would have been if it had been a country office of Oxfam GB. And that's less about a political decision. It's about a financial one. It's about big programming, so I think in a way, having these affiliates, if you imagine if Oxfam did no delivery of any humanitarian programming at all we did was have affiliates that engaged in national advocacy and policy debates, we would still have those problems of kind of, we don't want to speak out now because politically it's not right in Hong Kong or it's not right in Ireland. And that's that's another discussion, which is, you can weigh up whether it's worth Amnesty having a really strong office or whether keeping outside and being able to speak out. But yeah, what I was really thinking about is more this kind of more the financial incentive to silence rather than the political one. That's what I was getting at. Yeah, but they both exist. You're absolutely right. We've got questions in the chat. I don't know if either of you have noticed. We should probably.
In fact, this is an interesting one for you, Michael, because it says, from a historical perspective, I think you could answer that best. And you have a question from the audience that silence by humanitarian actors in face of injustice is also driven by the threat of losing access. And it's on demand of the local partners. And this is exactly the dilemma that Max outlined and you spoke about, that if I was a MSF supporter, I'm just not saying Oxfam because we've had too much of that for now. But, if I was an MSF supporter and I was giving money to MSF for relief in Tigray, I would really expect them to be doing that. Or if I was expecting them to deliver hospitals in Syria, what use is it for a MSF to become the most vocal partner in Tigray, or the most vocal external agency in Tigray, speak out, get thrown out, and not have access? And that's really the dilemma on the ground that drives a lot of the humanitarian imperative, Michael. Wouldn't you agree with that historically as well?
Yes, but the big but, which is that I agree in almost most cases, but there are those examples. For instance, going back right to the origins of MSF with Biafra and the idea of terminage and witnessing. And, what is, on the one hand, your point is to deliver food for the starving. On the other hand, it's also to bear witness so that you provide, you could provide information. And we've seen MSF over the years caught in this bind in Ethiopia. I mean, it's not just currently, it goes back to the 1980s and how it is that you position yourself when you see a state-based famine, which, is a form of genocide or certainly, crimes against humanity by any other name. And so I do, one of the things that, has to be debated then is, as you point out, is it access at all costs? At what point do you say that, and this is always very difficult. I mean, we've danced around it. We've talked a little about it, but at what point then does silence mean that you're complicit? At what point then, and this is where I think a lot of the humanitarians that I've seen and studied, it is one of those ethical dilemmas. And on the one hand, you don't want to be complicit. You don't want to be seen as doing harm in that sense. On the other hand, there has to be a realism that humanitarians are small fries in this big game. And it's not really clear that whether they leave or go really is going to make that much difference, or whether they are really that much complicit. But it is that question of how it is that you decide that you just simply, that there is no conscionable way to remain, especially if you think that demanding access may in fact be contributing to the ongoing suffering. And that's always very hard to judge in the moment. It's very hard for us to judge it after the fact. I mean, scholars will debate time and again over the Western response to the Holocaust, or, again, the response to Ethiopia or Biafra or Cambodia, at what cost access. And, we don't have a great way. There's no moral, scales for us to use retrospectively. This, for me, is one of those critical debates that goes on within organizations if they're doing their job. More often than not, they're just simply on autopilot and, would rather avoid having to, really confront these ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, and I think Andreas from the audience has followed that up by saying that what if humanitarian aid is instrumentalized by warring factions, and then it becomes directly responsible for continuing the conflict, which is the case as it may be in many parts of the world. And I think that's at the heart of that dilemma.
Yeah, although I think aid is always instrumentalized. I don't think we have any situations where it's really not. To the extent that, in order for humanitarian, there are occasions where aid just comes in, usually in natural disasters. But when we're looking at conflict situations, you have to be able to get access by appealing to the parties to let you in. And that means usually that the parties have decided that aid is good for them in one way or another, whether it's in terms of publicity or in terms of, that taxing the water that comes in. So aid's always instrumentalized. And I think that's, the fact that it's instrumentalized helps humanitarians get access in many situations. It's because they're being used. So I do think there is that, but it's as Andrea suggests, part of what you kind of would love is a cost benefit calculation. You'd love to be able to sit back and say at that moment, how many lives will be saved versus how many will be lost in this scenario versus the other scenario. And we have no way of knowing. And I think, because of that, because of the uncertainty, I think the instinct is often to just simply provide aid without questions. And maybe that's the right answer, is to simply say that we are going to provide aid, and we understand that it's going to be instrumentalized and there's going to be a cost. But do we really want to get in a situation then where we're constantly questioning ourselves as to whether aid does more harm than good? Because one of the things I've seen is that the moment aid agencies begin to entertain that debate, they get cautious. They begin to say, well, we don't know if we're doing more harm than good, so let's actually not act at all, which is, that other side of conservatism that we have to really worry about.
Max, would you want to weigh in on this?
I know, I agree. I think there is a huge cost to not doing something, and that is rarely. We have this. I can only talk about what I know, but we have like lots and lots of risk registers, but no opportunity registers. It's always about the level of risk, and I think there's a natural, as our industry has got more and more institutionalized and professionalized, then I think the kind of anarchic. I'm sorry, I keep talking about Oxfam, but obviously it's what I know best. But like we flew a plane of food into Cambodia just after it was liberated from Pol Pot by the Vietnamese army. When all the Western governments, because I like this as a good example of how aid agencies are not always the tool of Western governments. All the Western governments said, do not send any aid to Cambodia because they've been liberated by the North Vietnamese, who are the enemy, and we chose to ignore them. And we at huge risk to Oxfam, and at the time not a big organisation. We rented a plane, we rented a boat. Now I just don't think we would ever do that now. I don't, and it's not because those people. There was a level of recklessness and a kind of, but also a hubris as well, like a belief that we were right and we were doing the right thing. So there was a kind of downside. There's a downside to that too. But I mean, that level of kind of, fuck it, let's just do it. I don't think we're structured to do that anymore. And that, I think in some ways is a loss, because it means it doesn't happen in the way that perhaps it could.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example, and raises, a set of questions that really, I think, go beyond, what we've been licensed to talk about, but so be it.
Yeah,
this is freewheeling. But no, I mean, this goes into something that in which, many people have commented on, which is, the inordinate number of rules the layers of paperwork, the layers of bureaucracy, the layers of red tape, the growing professionalization that, at least to be I am the resident academic, but the way the German sociologist Max Weber talked about it was this iron cage in which you become so encased by the rules as you become a bureaucrat that you no longer able, as you're saying, you can't think. You're not supposed to think in a freewheeling manner. That's exactly the opposite of what we want from staff who are professional. And so for many people, then it does raise this growing concern about whether part of the problem that we're seeing with humanitarianism today is not just simply the financing, but rather this is what happens when a sector ages and matures. It gets stodgy and scoliotic and really cannot respond, as you say, in that freewheeling manner.
And Michael, I would say it's not just a function of age. And I again bring in the localization debate. A lot of the institutional red tapeism that is there is also because you have a situation where any humanitarian organization that is centered in the global north necessarily then gets all its affiliates and partners to subscribe to at least two legal regimes. You have all the business processes of the organization, which are rooted in the legal framework of the northern country where it's based on. Then you have, say, a local institution, a local branch of that organization rooted in the global south, subscribing to the laws of that country. And there is always a tension between the local and the global, as in wherever the institution is headquartered, or the Western, or call it what you may, the one in the global north. And it is this clash of business processes to standardize which you end up with a lot of institutional, the journey towards becoming moribund. I don't know, Max, if you would agree with this, but I think that's somewhere at the heart of the problem, that you're not able to deinstitutionalize business processes and hand it over to the global south, or in the countries where you're operating, so that you have, at least where you have a longer term presence that's not really restricted only to a quick fix humanitarian action, if there is such a thing, subjecting them to multiple regimes.
I suppose I would say from my more recent experience that something that gives me a more positive feeling is that it is about kind of campaigning in coalition and in social movements and being more of a follower and less a leader, but also being very, very supportive. So, it's not an entirely a fix, but if we've got at the moment we're very much a part of this campaign for a people's vaccine, and we've got activists, say in Kenya, who want to go out and demand that their government does more on vaccine access, and it happens through that social movement, and it's not happening through the Oxfam office, but they know about it and they're broadly supportive, but there is a level of distance, so I think there are spaces that you can occupy and ways that you can try and be creative, so that, and you can't always have your cake and eat it. There will always be trade-offs between access and campaigning, but I don't think they're as dramatic and as obvious in every situation that you have to make that choice. Sometimes you can do a lot of personally, I think, as I said at the beginning, I'm a campaigner. I think there's a lot more space for fighting for social justice than the professional NGO industry thinks that there is in almost every country. And there are lots of ways to do that can be done creatively and unbranded and in ways that support movements that just need a different mindset. I don't necessarily need much more than that. They don't even need much money. It's something that mobilizes people, then people will mobilize. It's not an expensive business, and I think the fight for against vaccine injustice is a good example, because it's been a huge mobilizer worldwide, and really you're just jumping into a flowing stream and you're helping to think about where that stream goes, instead of leading from the front in any major way. So I think I would add that. Yeah.
Yeah, that it does raise though this, as I listen to your vignette about Kenya, it does lead this question though about who decides what campaigns are going to be launched, right? And so much of it has been, at least the campaigns that I'm aware of, because I'm situated in the West, have been Western driven campaigns. These are the campaigns that we've seen in global health, for instance. These are the diseases that, for whatever reason, grab the attention of those in the West, as opposed to campaigns that are more homegrown and locally driven. But this always gets, it gets us back to that big question of power about who gets to decide which campaigns. And then part of that is also about marketability, which you need the money to run the campaigns, and which campaigns are likely to generate the revenue so that you can do it. And we get back then to these power dynamics. So it's a very difficult situation.
But Michael, I think in some ways this is answered by campaigns which are driven, which have zero resonance in the countries where they're launched. I mean,
Yeah.
if the campaign is not relevant, there's no amount of money that can do the talking. People will not. You may get in a editorial here or there, but it won't really take shape of a people's campaign. And I think the important distinction that one needs to make in what Max said is really that you when you as a humanitarian or a global organization are creating a space that you do not intend to occupy, and perhaps the people's vaccine space is one such space, which gets co-created by multiple partners where Oxfam takes the lead, but it's not an Oxfam campaign. It was never perceived to be, it is not meant to be perceived as one, even though a lot of the background work initially may have been done. But then there are, of course, the funding campaigns, the fundraising campaigns, which are
Yeah.
intrinsic to your ability to excite your donors enough to get the money flowing, be it individual donors or institutional donors, where it's a completely different ball game altogether. And therefore, what often happens in practice is that the institutional negotiation for this ends up with a common minimum lowest common denominator campaign that everybody around the table agrees to, with regional variations and local variations as may be. And I think that's the way it gets resolved. But we have just 3 or 4 minutes, three minutes left. So just as a wrap up question, perhaps to Michael and Max, where do you see this discussion going 5 years from now? Are there any changes in mindset that are required, or are we going to continue as we have? Or do you see a transformational moment within the next 5 years happening in this space?
Oh, the cynic in me says that these debates rarely change. That we've seen localization for 20 years, and I think localization is sort of dead, for instance. But long live localization; it'll come back in various ways. So on the one hand, the more things change, the more things stay the same. On the other hand, one of the things that I do see is that there is a growing space, I think, for, call it localization, but for a more locally driven justice and humanitarian movement. And the reason is because of, I think, several things. One has to do with the growing disengagement of the West. In many ways, the nationalism and populism that we see in the West, although it varies worrisome to someone like me, it does create, it removes some of those tentacles. It creates more space for those in the global South to assert themselves. It's that kind of delinking that we've seen time and time again, during World Wars I and World War II, where, the retreat of the West actually can have benefits for local resistance, local campaigns, and so forth. I think COVID is one of those moments where, again, it's that question of access. Without access and without resources, it provides more, in some ways, certainly more motives, but more opportunities. I think climate change is going to do this as well. So I do think that there are, there are growing opportunities. I think the big issue is going to be money. Sort of, if in fact, and I suspect, from what I've learned, Barrage, over the last hour, you'll probably agree with me that until that so-called business model, another example of the corporatization of humanitarianism, until that business model changes, so it's no longer, that awful trickle down that I'm very familiar from Reaganomics, but rather it's something that is more local, this will continue to be a problem.
Right. The last words, Max, to wrap this up.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful summary, Michael. And I think the perspective of history is a good one. We don't want to make a kind of silver lining in a very dark cloud of civil society space closing, but I do think you're seeing a much more kind of robust, the kind of the number of governments who say, no, we can look after ourselves is growing all the time and has been doing for decades, isn't it? So that, in a sense, is, and the aid business itself is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Increasingly about a smaller group of fragile states, increasingly just in Africa. So that is a trend, I think, which I think will be dented by COVID, but will continue. I just wanted to finish with one other point to build on what Michael said. I think it will always remain the responsibility of Western development agencies to call out their own governments. And I think that's something we haven't talked about enough. So it kind of, that is absolutely our responsibility, and so I'm very proud of, for instance, the work we've done on the arms sales of the US and the UK to the Saudis in Yemen. There will always be continued, and if there's one thing COVID had shown us, is that the rich world is absolutely appalling at looking after our global self-interest. So I would just add that at the end, that will always be our responsibility, whatever happens, and we should never stop doing that.
Okay. So thanks